These three disturbing Appalachian Mountains horror stories are inspired by real events. First, a detective enters a silent cabin where a family lies dead without a single scratch, only to feel a cold gaze watching him from the empty room. Next, a runner's heart explodes at 250 beats per minute, dragged into the woods by a violence that left no footprints. Finally, a ranger in a blinding blizzard finds a man in a thin yellow suit, standing frozen and smiling in the dark. You need to watch until the very end, because when you see what was waiting in her rearview mirror, you'll never drive alone again. In August 2016, a family of three was found dead in their beds inside a quiet Appalachian cabin, but there wasn't a single scratch or bruise on any of them. Every mirror in the house was covered with black cloth, and every clock was stuck at 3:30 a.m., yet police found no signs of poison or any break-in. This medical mystery was terrifying, yet it paled in comparison to what Detective Lane found sitting in his locked patrol car after he finished the investigation. He thought he was alone, but a single object on his seat proved that someone had been watching him from the shadows the entire time. Imagine a guy like Detective Lane for a second. 20 years on the force changes a man. It turns your skin into leather and your gut instincts into a radar. Lane didn't believe in ghosts or mountain legends. He trusted his flashlight, his Smith & Wesson, and hard evidence. When the call came in about a silent house near the ridge, he figured it was a tragic accident. Carbon monoxide, maybe, or a gas leak. He parked his cruiser on the gravel, stepping out into the thick, wet heat of a mountain afternoon. Cicadas were screaming in the trees. You know that sound. It's a high-pitched electric shriek that usually means it's just a lazy summer day. But up here, surrounded by dense woods, it sounded like a warning. Lane wiped sweat from his forehead and walked up the porch steps. Boards creaked under his heavy boots. He reached for the front doorknob, unlocked. It swung open with a dry, splintering moan that echoed down the dark hallway. Lane announced himself, shouting "Police!" into the gloom. Silence answered him. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. Dust motes danced in the light of the open door, settling on the floorboards like gray snow. He clicked on his heavy maglite. The beam cut through the stagnant air, landing on the first thing that made him pause. Right there in the hallway, a large oval mirror was completely covered. Someone had taken a black bedsheet and pinned it tight over the glass. You couldn't see a single inch of reflection. Lane frowned, his hand drifting to his belt. He walked past it, boots thudding softly on the wood. Kitchen came next. Dishes sat drying in the rack. A half-finished cup of coffee had a ring of mold on top. Lane shined his light on the stove. Digital numbers glowed green in the dim light. They weren't blinking, they were solid. 3:33. He checked his watch. It was just past noon. He tapped the stove clock. Nothing changed. It was frozen in time. Master bedroom door stood half open. Lane pushed it wide. Heavy curtains blocked out the sun, casting the room in a weird orange glow. Dottie and her husband were in bed. They looked like they were just taking a nap. Lane walked over, keeping his breathing steady. He placed 2 fingers on Dottie's neck. Cool skin, no pulse. But she looked peaceful. Too peaceful. There wasn't a mark on her. No signs of struggle, no blue tint to her lips. Just gone. Lane looked around the room. On the dresser, the vanity mirror was draped in black cloth. The alarm clock on the nightstand was unplugged, but the hands behind the plastic face were stuck. 3:33, same as the kitchen. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck. It's that feeling you get when you know you aren't the only one in a room. even if the only other person there isn't breathing anymore. He checked the kid's room down the hall. Same story. Little girl tucked in with her stuffed bear. Gone. Mirror covered. Clock stopped at 3:33. Lane had seen enough crime scenes to know when something was wrong. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a stage. Someone had set this up. He spent an hour clearing the house. Every window was locked. Back door was deadbolted from the inside. No footprints in the dust except his own. It was a locked box. Lane called in the coroner and the hazmat teams on his shoulder radio. He needed air. He needed to get away from those covered mirrors. He walked out the front door, pulling it shut until it clicked. He double-checked it. Locked. He walked down the porch steps, wiping his face. That heat hit him again, smelling of pine needles and baking asphalt. He walked the 50 yards back to his patrol car. Sunlight glinted off the windshield. Lane fished his keys out of his pocket. He unlocked the driver's side door. A wave of superheated air rolled out, smelling like hot plastic. He sat down, groaning as the heat seeped into his uniform. He reached for the dashboard radio to update dispatch. His hand stopped mid-air. Sitting right there on the driver's seat, where he had been sitting 20 minutes ago, was a single sheet of yellow notebook paper. Lane stared at it. His heart started a hard, rhythmic drumming against his ribs. He knew he had locked the car. He was certain. It was muscle memory. He looked at the paper. It was covered in ink. Hundreds of tiny, frantic scribbles. Every single line was the same. 3:33 a.m., 3:33 a.m., 3:33 a.m. Purple ink filled the page loop after loop until the yellow paper was almost black with it. Lane picked it up. The ink smeared on his thumb. It was wet, fresh. Someone had written this in the last 10 minutes. While he was inside the house, he recognized the handwriting immediately. He had just seen it on a grocery list on the cabin's fridge. It was Dottie's handwriting. The loops were unmistakable. But Dottie had been dead for hours. Lane didn't call it in right away. He just sat there, the locked car suddenly feeling like a cage. He looked out the window at the thick Appalachian woods. Trees were dense, dark, and perfectly still. Then he noticed something else. The cicadas had stopped. That electric screaming was gone. The silence was sudden and violent. If Dottie didn't write that note while she was dead, then someone else did. Someone who could mimic her handwriting perfectly. Someone who could get into a locked police cruiser without a sound. And if they put it there while Lane was inside the cabin, it meant they were watching him the whole time. Lane locked the doors. He sat there, hand on his gun, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but he felt eyes on him. Someone was just inside the shadows, maybe 10 feet away, watching him read that note, watching him panic. He didn't wait for the coroner. He threw the car into reverse and spun out of the gravel driveway, tires spitting rocks. He drove fast until he hit the main road. The case is still open. They never found a suspect. They never found a cause of death for the family. Autopsies came back clean. Just hearts that decided to stop beating. Lane retired a few months later. He moved to a city far away from the mountains. But he doesn't keep clocks in his house anymore. And if you visit him, you'll notice something else. Every mirror in his hallway is turned toward the wall. He still wonders. If someone was in those trees watching him that day, who's to say they didn't follow him home? Some things you just don't get over. You just learn to live with the lights on. When the trail runner's body was found, the digital forensics proved his heart maintained 250 beats per minute for 3 minutes, while moving at the impossible speed of 60 miles per hour. But what Detective Gentry found at the end of that 3-mile crime scene reveals a level of calculated cruelty that no mountain legend could ever match. Deep in the Monongahela National Forest, the air carries the scent of damp pine and old dirt. It is the kind of quiet that makes a person feel like the only soul left on Earth. Julian liked that quiet. He was a marathon runner who lived by his stopwatch and his heart rate monitor. On that June afternoon, he had his noise-canceling headphones clamped over his ears. He was playing a heavy beat to keep his pace. He never heard the machine coming for him. Detective Gentry stood at the edge of a limestone ravine 3 days later. He looked at the crime scene the way a mechanic looks at a busted engine, impartial, tired, and focused entirely on the nuts and bolts of the wreck. Next to him stood Officer Hunter, a local man who had spent his life in these woods. Hunter's hands shook as he held a printout of the data from Julian's fitness watch. Heat radiated off the limestone. It cooked the smell of pine needles until the air felt thick and sticky. Gentry wiped sweat from his neck with a handkerchief. He watched a hawk circle overhead. It was looking for food. Everything out here was looking for food. Hunter cleared his throat. He pointed a trembling finger at the paper. He told Gentry that Julian's heart rate hit 250. He said, a human heart should not be able to do that without bursting. It was physically impossible for a runner. Gentry did not look up. He was staring at a long, dark smear on the trail. It looked like someone had dragged a heavy bag of wet paint through the dust. Hunter kept talking. He explained that the GPS showed Julian moving at 60 miles per hour. For 3 miles, he was doing highway speeds on a dirt path. There were no truck tracks wide enough for a pickup. The trail was too narrow. The locals were already talking about things that hide in the hills. They were whispering about something fast and ancient that had caught him. Gentry finally looked at him. His face was hard, like a piece of granite that had been weathering in the creek for too long. He said, "People like ghost stories because they are easier to handle than the truth." He told Hunter a monster didn't do this. A person did, and that was much worse. Gentry started walking back down the trail. He needed to retrace those 3 miles of impossible speed. He kept his eyes on the ground. He was not looking for paw prints. He was looking for what he called the red ribbon. It was a trail of blood and shredded gear that marked Julian's final path. Silence hung over the woods. Usually you hear birds or squirrels. Today, the forest held its breath. It felt like the trees were watching them, waiting to see if they would figure it out. Every few hundred yards, Gentry stopped. He crouched down to look at the roots of the trees lining the path. They were scraped clean of bark. Something hard and metal had bashed against them. He saw rocks that had been sparked by steel. He saw low branches snapped off, leaving jagged white wood exposed. This wasn't just a murder scene. It was a collision course. About a mile back, Gentry stopped. He looked up and saw a heavy-duty winch cable snapped and tangled in a low-hanging oak branch. It swayed in the breeze. It hit the wood with a dull, rhythmic metallic ring. Gentry knelt in the soft mud beneath the tree. He pushed aside a fern. There it was. He found the sharp, aggressive tread of a high-performance racing vehicle. It wasn't a truck. It was a modified ATV, built low and wide. It was a machine built to go where trucks cannot fit. He realized then that Julian had been the victim of a blitz. Gentry stood up and looked down the long, empty tunnel of trees. He could see it playing out in his mind. The killer had been sitting in the brush, engine off. He was waiting for a lone target. He was hunting. When Julian ran past, his music blocking out the world, the killer didn't just chase him. He stepped on the gas. But they did not want to hit him. They wanted to keep him. This killer had modified the vehicle. They welded on a side-mounted spring-loaded steel hook. It was something you might use to snag cattle or drag logs. As the machine roared past Julian, the hook snapped out. It did not just snag his clothes. It drove deep into Julian's body, anchoring into bone and muscle. Julian did not have time to scream. The vehicle never slowed down. The driver floored it, hitting 60 miles per hour instantly. That 250 beats per minute heart rate was not running. It was the sound of a human body in total shock. It was the physical record of Julian fighting to stay conscious while the forest floor tore him apart. He was nothing more than a weight behind a machine. He was dragged for 3 miles. The rocks, the roots, the hard-packed dirt, he felt every inch of it. The speed was so great that his body was skipping across the ground like a stone on water. Gentry reached the spot where the drag began. He found Julian's water bottle lying in a ditch. He picked it up. It was crushed flat. One side was melted plastic, smoothed down by the heat of high-speed friction against the ground. Gentry told Hunter that Julian never saw it coming. Hunter looked at the snapped cable in the tree. He looked pale. He asked why the cable stopped at the ravine. Gentry explained that the hook snapped. He pointed to deep gouges in the limestone at the edge of the cliff. The vehicle had turned hard, drifting sideways in the dirt. The tension was too much for the steel line. The cable whipped back and hit that branch, but Julian's body kept going. Momentum carried him. He flew over the edge like a piece of unwanted cargo. Standing in the heavy heat of the afternoon, the two men looked at the ravine. The forest felt different now. It did not feel peaceful. It felt like a cage. It felt like a place where the rules of civilization did not apply. Down in the ravine, the recovery team had found Julian's headphones. They were expensive ones, built to take a beating. When the electronics expert turned them on, they were still working. A fast, upbeat song pushed through the tiny speakers. It was the same rhythm Julian's heart had tried to keep right before it stopped. Gentry looked into the thick brush where the tire tracks disappeared. There were no more sounds of engines. There was just a deep, heavy quiet. This killer had not left a name. They had not left a message. They just left a 3-mile trail of evidence that a human being can be turned into a sport. Hunter wiped sweat from his forehead. He asked if they were going to find them. Gentry did not answer immediately. He looked at the dense green wall of the forest. He looked at the way the brush had closed back up, perfectly hiding the path the vehicle took. Out here, there are thousands of miles of hidden trails. Old logging roads, deer paths, dried creek beds. Someone with a fast machine and a steel hook could stay lost forever. "No," Gentry said finally. "We won't find him today." Somewhere out there in a garage hidden by pine limbs, a man was likely hosing blood off a steel winch. He was likely checking his own stopwatch, wondering if he could beat his 3-mile record next time. He was probably looking at a map, picking a new trail. Julian's heart had given out at the ravine, but the terror of the woods was just getting started. As the sun began to drop behind the peaks, the shadows grew long and thin. They stretched across the road like black fingers. Gentry turned to head back to his truck. He walked with a heavy step. He did not run. But for the first time in his life, he kept his ears open. He wasn't listening for birds. He was listening for the sound of a distant motor. He knew that in these woods, the most dangerous thing isn't what has claws. It is what has a gas tank and a plan. When Ranger Alma was on a routine patrol at the Craggy Gardens Pass, she found a man in a bright yellow suit standing in a lethal minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit whiteout. He had no coat or gloves, yet he just stood there with a creepy, wide grin. That was haunting. But when she tried to leave, that's when things became simply terrifying. 1982 was a rough year for the high country. If you worked the Craggy Gardens Pass in North Carolina, you remember the snow. It wasn't just a storm, it was a burial. The drifts were high enough to swallow a car, and the air was cold enough to snap bolts off a guardrail. Alma knew these roads. She was built of mountain stone and iron grit. She didn't have time for ghost stories. She dealt in hard facts like tire chains, frozen radiators, and keeping folks alive. Her job was simple: drive the ridge and make sure nobody froze to death on her watch. Conditions were getting worse. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. Inside her patrol truck, the heater rattled, fighting a losing war against the cold. Frost was already creeping across the inside of the glass. Alma shifted gears, keeping the heavy truck moving slow near a drop-off called the Hollow. It was a nasty stretch of road in summer. In a blizzard, it was a death trap. A sharp rattling noise suddenly filled the cab. It sounded like metal hitting metal deep under the hood. Before Alma could check her gauges, the truck gave a sick, wheezing cough. The dashboard lights flickered once and died. Silence hit the cab like a hammer. The heater stopped blowing. The only sound left was the wind outside, whistling through the cracks in the doorframe. Alma swore quietly and turned the key. The engine made a single, dead ticking sound. The battery was gone. She sat there for a moment. Her breath started to cloud up in the air, thick and white. Sitting still meant freezing. She had to check the engine. She zipped her heavy parka to her chin and grabbed her flashlight. Opening the door was a fight against the wind. She shoved it open with her shoulder and stepped out into the storm. Ice crystals hit her face like broken glass. Alma shielded her eyes with a gloved hand. She looked down the road, hoping to see headlights. She didn't see headlights. She saw color. 50 yards ahead, standing right in the middle of the road, was a shape. It was bright yellow. Not safety yellow, like a vest. It was the color of a cheap plastic toy. Alma squinted against the stinging snow. Through the swirling white, she made out a man. He was just standing there. He wasn't moving. He was planted in the center of the lane, facing her truck. Confusion hit her first. This guy wasn't wearing a coat. He wasn't wearing a hat. He stood in the middle of a blizzard, in 20 below weather, wearing a bright polyester suit. "Hey!" Alma yelled. The wind snatched the word right out of her mouth. She started walking toward him. The snow was deep, but she kept moving. She thought about medical reasons. She knew freezing people sometimes got confused and stripped their clothes off. "Sir, you need to get in the truck," she screamed. He didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. Alma kept walking. She was 20 feet away now. The details of him started to come into focus, and her stomach turned sour. His suit was perfectly clean. In a storm this violent, he should have been covered in snow. But the yellow fabric was dry. It looked stiff, like it had been starched and ironed that morning. The wind was gusting at 60 miles an hour, but his jacket didn't flap. It hung on him like it was carved out of wood. 10 feet away, Alma raised her flashlight. The beam cut through the dark and hit him square in the face. She stopped dead. The man wasn't shivering. His skin wasn't pale or blue. It looked like wax, but it was his eyes that made Alma want to run. They were wide open. The wind was blowing ice directly into his face, but he didn't blink. Not once. His pupils were black holes fixed on her, and he was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too big. The corners of his mouth stretched way too far across his face. It exposed teeth that looked too long and too white. It was the kind of grin a shark gives before it bites. Alma stood there, freezing air burning her lungs. She waited for him to breathe, but there was no steam coming from his mouth. He was just a solid yellow object in the white void. A deep primal warning went off in Alma's head. Run. She spun around and sprinted back to the truck. She slipped in the deep snow, scrambling on her hands and knees. She didn't look back. She could feel his eyes on her back. She reached the truck, threw herself inside, and smashed the lock down. Her hands shook as she jammed the key into the ignition. She squeezed her eyes shut and turned it. The engine roared to life. It didn't sputter. It started strong, like it had never died. The headlights cut back on, flooding the snowy road with light. Alma let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She grabbed the gear shift. "Okay," she whispered. She looked out the windshield. The road was empty. The yellow shape was gone. There was just the swirling white snow and the black trees. He had vanished. Alma relaxed her grip on the wheel. She thought the coast was clear. She put the truck in drive. Right before she hit the gas, she glanced to her right to check the mirror. She screamed. He wasn't gone. The man in the yellow suit was right there. His face was pressed hard against the passenger window. His skin was mashed flat against the glass, distorting his features into a pale, wet smear. His eyes were wide, staring inches from her own, and that smile was wider than ever, stretching from ear to ear, showing every single tooth. He didn't move. He just pressed harder against the glass as the truck idled. Alma didn't think. She stomped on the gas pedal. The tires spun on the ice, caught traction, and the truck shot forward. She drove down that mountain at 50 miles an hour, risking a slide into the ravine just to get away from the hollow. She never looked in the rearview mirror. You might think Alma was just seeing things in the storm, but you have to remember where this happened. The Appalachians are ancient, older than the rings of Saturn, and they keep their secrets well. In these mountains, nearly half of the people who go missing are never found. Not a boot, not a trace, and not a single scent for the dogs to follow. They just cease to exist. Ranger Alma was one of the lucky ones. In a place where people vanish into thin air, the man in the yellow suit isn't just a ghost story. He's a warning of what's waiting out there in the whiteout, smiling at the things that still need to breathe.